here we are still Tuesday, November 5th, election day in Cambridge. And, you know, uh, a few more things perhaps we can talk about. Now, one of the, maybe I just had a little more free time over the last few weeks, but I found myself going to more uh, public meetings and open houses and things, roundtable meetings than I usually would. Um, you know, and there are the sort of the major issues. I think certainly when we had city council meeting earlier in October having to do with we set the tax rate, and in various other lead-ins to that, there's been a real concern that the salad days, as they say, of tremendous excess in levy capacity and um, keeping residential tax rates relatively in check, thanks to the marvelous amount of commercial development that we've managed to permit in Cambridge, so that 2/3 of the tax burden is borne by the commercial tax base. That maybe things are changing. I mean, commercial valuations are flat and may very well be seeing a decrease come the next round of assessments. Um, and meanwhile, residential values are still going up, though apparently, according to the people in the city assessor's office, maybe they're not continuing to just spiral out of control with exponential growth. I mean, things are still very costly, but it may well be that there's a bit of a cooling off in residential values due to things like higher financing costs and other factors as well. So we'll see. But I think it's a really important conversation that city councilors and city administration and the public should be getting into, to sort of talk about really where we stand, so that we're not just in this constant mode of just saying, well, whatever programmatic idea you have, we'll find a way to fund it and fund it richly. Um, one of the little sort of undercurrents I might mention here is that we've actually been funding this thing, what's it called? Rise Up Cambridge, I think it was called. It was a program that basically hands $500 per month to uh, people who meet certain criteria, no questions asked, no strings attached, whatever. Just here it is, free money. Um, which is, it's sort of a form of a welfare program, right? But that's not legal under Massachusetts law and the Anti-Aid Amendment. So, but because we had this ARPA money, from federal government, which was COVID relief related money, cities all over the place just diverted that money from things that really didn't have much to do, if anything, to do with COVID. I think for Cambridge, we put about $22 million, if I'm not mistaken, toward this Rise Up Cambridge, which was an initiative that I think Councillor Siddiqui, when she was mayor, tried very hard to associate with her name, you know, which was maybe correct, or just maybe a political calculation. I don't know. But there was a city council order a month ago saying, like, well, we have to find a way to, now that the ARPA money is not going to be forever, how can we continue this program? And currently it's not legal under Massachusetts law. So you would probably have to have something like a home rule petition to allow Cambridge to actually use property tax money for this. I'm not so sure that that would prevail, by the way, but it's a real concern. And the reason I'm mentioning it here right now is in this atmosphere um, where there's now a growing concern that money is no longer going to be growing on trees, and we still have certain infrastructure projects that need to be done, school projects, school building projects, firehouse renovations that need to be done. We also have universal pre-K program, which was brand new addition to the operating costs from now till perhaps forever. That maybe there isn't just free money to continue the Rise Up Cambridge program. So at least it's maybe I'm reading between the lines too much, but you could almost detect Counselor Siddiqui's angst whenever sort of trying to, people would talk about limitations in funding. It seemed like as if she was saying, but you got to find a way to get this money because, this is my program, or at least she thinks it's her program. Um, and I don't know that that's going to be possible, right? Unless something miraculous happens in terms of commercial assessments going back up again and new development happening. Honestly, there's just not a lot of commercial or even residential development really happening right now. There's a lot of projects sort of that are underway that are being finished up, to be sure. But money isn't going to grow on trees, and any kind of new tax levy capacity that comes from new commercial construction is kind of limited. So there was a roundtable meeting that was on this topic on October 28th. And it's sort of been a discussion, just sort of been floating around. And so I was at that, and I'm finding it very interesting. And I hope some of the elected officials will find it interesting too, because it's oftentimes we have this kind of a bad dichotomy where elected officials want to get credit for creating programs and funding new initiatives and doing all that. And oftentimes it's the city management's job to either fund it or tell the council, we can't do that. We don't have infinite amount of money. And so I always think it's a very healthy thing when some of the elected officials can at least see things through the eyes of the city administration. So having these kinds of hearings, roundtable meetings, there's going to be another one later in the year too about, public investment funding and what have you. And, hopefully just talk about what's possible or not possible. We'll see. But, some people may not like to look at that way, but I actually think that cities run better when they're forced to be more efficient. Um, Everything's just done a lot more intelligently, and it's not always the case when people are just flinging money at things. So we'll see. Now, another thing, it's kind of a big item, and I know I talked about this a few weeks ago, was that there's this proposal that is being, I think, rather wrongly characterized as the multifamily zoning petition. But it really isn't a multifamily zoning petition. Basically, the idea is it would permit multifamily housing to be built in all residential zones of the city. But that's such a bad way to advertise something, which is in fact probably the single largest residential upzoning petition or initiative I've ever seen in all the years I've lived in Cambridge, which is over 46 years. Basically, we have different residential districts. The bigger ones are resident C1. There's also resident A, which is primarily single family. Resident B, which has a lot of two family. You know, not exclusively, by the way. Because there's a lot of legacy properties in there, and there are a lot of buildings that may have been built as singles or twos that have been operated as something else, whether whether they just are because nobody bothered to check. I don't know. But what this proposal calls for is obliterating those residential districts and just merging them all. Residence A, which is think single, resident B, think two family, resident C1, think of things like triple deckers, etc. But even residence C has limit, and I live in a residence C1. Well, I live in a mixed use district, but anything residential has to follow the C1 rules, which has things like a 35-foot height and a 0.75 floor area ratio. This proposal wants to turn all the residential zones, A, B, C, C1, and any others that may be hidden on the map that I didn't bother to say, all into something that makes residence C1 look tiny in comparison. So in other words, rather than having 35-foot limits, they want to have 6 and 7 story limits, which is typical stories these days, or on the low end of residential when it would be 10 foot, but it's really usually closer to 11 or 12 these days. So we're talking about going from 35-foot height limits in residential zones to more like 70 some odd foot. So it's doubling the heights. And also relaxing setback requirements so that buildings could be built more cheek to jowl. And I live in a triple decker. I own a triple decker here in a residence C1 district, and I can tell you that, this proposal would be taller, denser than what I have here. And I can tell you that we should have just a little bit more breathing room between the adjacent buildings. So how this managed to get rammed through, from I think maybe Mr. Azim, who still I believe is collecting a paycheck from Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. So is he a city councilor or is he a lobbyist? I'm not sure. Like obviously he would maybe be both, certainly. But where is this all coming from? So the city had things like open houses. They had one at least was on Zoom. I did not participate in that. Another one was held at the senior center where they had a lot of nice billboards around there to sort of tell the story of it all. Was not on the city calendar, but there was postcards sent around the city. So I guess you could argue people should have known about it. It's a lot of times it's the usual people you already know, the ones who show up at these meetings. And I'm not talking about the NIMBYs and the people who are part of that book that the ABC people keep telling everybody to read. That anybody who shows up for public meetings, they should need to be ignored. I think a lot of people who I never saw showed up at this meeting and they were actually really alarmed. I mean, they decided to live and invest in a home in Cambridge on a street that, where there's a certain scale and a neighborhood feel. And now basically if Mrs. McGillicuddy down the street passes away and she lives on a large lot, and then the family just sells it to the highest bidder, it may well go to some developer who decides wants to max it out. To get as many units, as much height and as least little setback as possible, and just basically put this tremendous sore thumb in the middle of a block. There are some suggestions from counselors that say, well, okay, maybe we don't want that on, quote, neighborhood streets. So maybe we should be concentrating all the supersizing in the squares. I don't really object to that personally, or on the corridors. Some of us, I live on Broadway. Depending on whose definition you look at, Broadway is sometimes treated as a corridor, and sometimes it's not treated as a corridor. When the AHO 2.0 showed up, miraculously, Broadway became an AHO corridor. But in the Envision Cambridge study, which supposedly was what a lot of this stuff was based on, it was never treated as a major corridor. It was streets like Cambridge Street, Massachusetts Avenue, Prospect Street. These were more the corridors. Um, so is that going to be the bad compromise that comes out of this? As people say, well, let's be nice to the people who are on the nice, quiet streets, and we'll just basically allow even bigger 13-story, 18-story buildings on corridors like Broadway, and basically let them bear the brunt of all of this. And it will be a problem. I mean, I'm not opposed to hike, but I am somewhat comfortable in a setting here where I'm not surrounded by too many large buildings. I, if I wanted to live in Kendall Square, I would have moved to Kendall Square. But that's not where I live. I live in mid Cambridge and I'm not particularly appreciative of what's being pushed through. Now, there was another public meeting that I attended on, I was at October, I forget, but it was a committee meeting on the Economic Development University Relations Committee, which is chaired by Paul Toner. And the city came in with a big presentation. Basically, it was about what the economic and zoning and housing impacts would, of this thing. So they had this sort of big handout here, and I have it linked off the website. Housing, zoning, and their impacts on Cambridge services and the economy. So I went to this thing, and I was able to see the presentation at least briefly before the meeting. And there's something that really I found alarming to the point of disgusting, honestly. So it says in there, it says, Envision Cambridge set aggressive housing targets, 12,500 new units by 2030, of which 3,175 should be affordable units. Okay. Now, if you read the Envision Cambridge report, you will find that is in there. Okay. But that presumably came about as a result of the housing working group of Envision Cambridge, of which I was a member. And I, unlike anybody else on that committee, I never missed a meeting. So I remember exactly what was said, what was presented, and what was proposed. And those numbers, they were never proposed. They just appeared in the final report, I think, because a person or two within community development department decided this is just what they wanted, because we don't, we need to have a lot more housing. So they just decided, which basically means why were those of us who participated in the process even there? If in fact we were just going to be ignored and the big shots in CDD are just going to basically impose the numbers. I did go look back though at some of the presentations and just wanted to say, well, where did that number come from? Because honestly, a lot of the zoning, they're basically saying that they set these aggressive targets and we're not meeting those targets. So therefore we have to triple zone things in the city to allow dramatic increases in height and density to meet these goals that came out of nowhere. So I went back to the housing working group from Envision Cambridge and I found the reports about potential programs that could actually lead to more units. So in other words, they're going to set a goal based on some certain proposals, certainly the affordable housing overlay, which sort of came out of nowhere as part of that process. That was a part of it, to be sure. But they also talked about two things. One was called super inclusionary zoning, and the other one was called, I forget what it was called here, environmental performance standards. In other words, if a new development meets certain wonderful environmental standards, then they would be allowed to build more densely. And then that might actually produce some new units, right? The super inclusionary proposal, which basically would have, right now when they modified the inclusionary zoning to take it from a 15% requirement up to a flat 20% just a few years ago, that actually has quieted down residential development because, if it applies to buildings that are more 10 units or greater, there's a lot of projects that are choosing to build at fewer than 10 units, so they're not subject to the inclusionary zoning standards. The other thing too is that many developers, especially in the current financing situation, they say simply, it doesn't pencil out. So I don't want to build that project, of it because and to require these inclusionary ones. So they basically go do other projects. These people still want to make money and do their jobs, right? But so there's been a real stifling of residential production. And even in the state law that was meant to Mass Communities Act was to sort of encourage residential development across the board. They even put a clause in there saying like you know, inclusionary zoning should not be allowed to basically kill the production here. So you basically don't do it or lower the requirements under inclusionary zoning if it's going to actually make it difficult or if not impossible for residential units to be built. So my point here is this, is that the 20% standard that we right now have is problematic. The city council, if they actually have the brilliance to actually take what may be seen as a politically risky, but I think it would be more of a politically thoughtful move, which is to adjust that downward a little bit to allow production to pick up, right? That's what they probably should do. And there've actually some city council are talking about such things. But why is that relevant here right now? Well, because under this super inclusionary thing, which by the way is what the big numbers of Envision's goals is based on, they would have required, they said, we'll allow you to build X number of extra units, or Y number of units or Z number of units. If we require 30% affordable units, inclusionary units, Tier B was 35% standard, and tier C would be 40% standard. So allowing those increases there, they estimated that that would enable the addition of um, enough units so that we could actually get as high as 12,300 units. And it was actually 12,400 if you allowed super inclusionary coupled with environmental performance bonuses. So from that, they came up with 12,400. The city then rounds it up to 12,500. Guess what, folks? We never passed super inclusionary. In fact, percentages like 40%, 35%, 30% are absurd in this environment. Even the current 20% is problematic. So we're now proposing a massive upzoning, residential zoning of Cambridge based on a goal that is rooted in fiction. Now you can say, because if you're Burhan Azim or Jivan Sabrina Wheeler, you sort of say, doesn't matter. Don't you know, single family zoning is evil anyway. So the more we can put 6-story, 7-story apartment buildings on Brattle Street, the better. Maybe that's your goal. Certainly there are some of the real hardliners within the A Better Cambridge, better known as A Bigger Cambridge group, that somehow think that this is exactly what should happen, is that all of Cambridge should become like downtown Flushing, New York, you know. But the point I made at this hearing was simply that these numbers, your goals, are based on nonsense. And I stand by that. I mean, I know Iram Farouk from Community Development Department says, no, actually, we looked at projections from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council that said, the urban core needs to produce X number of units. So we chose our numbers based on that. Well, if that's really what you chose your numbers on, then please don't say Envision Cambridge set aggressive housing targets. Just say you did, because that would be a much more honest statement, right? Now, I'm not anti-housing. I think we do need more units, but I do think that it ought to be done more thoughtfully. Just obliterating all the different residential zones and saying everything should be one set standard of, like, 6 stories, whatever, all across the board is an ignorant and lazy way to do planning. And I even said that to some of the city staff. This is dreadful. This is lazy, and it is. But that's really what's before us right now. And the city council has a few hearings coming up. Another meetings of the now it's been referred. The matter has been referred to the ordinance committee. They're going to have one meeting in a few weeks where it'll be only public comment, and then there'll be another one in December where there'll be no public comment. This is awfully reminiscent of what was happening in 2020 when they were pushing through some of the amendments to the cycling safety ordinance and the affordable housing 2.0, which is basically just get everybody let vent, and then some of the inside players are going to basically push through whatever they want, and they will do it in darkness. By the way, one of the more objectionable aspects of the affordable housing overlay was the fact that even the planning board was removed out of the process for all intents and purposes. They basically could say to the Affordable Housing Trust or one of the AHO developers, says, well, here are some ideas we think would be nice for you to consider. And then the developer can say, well, that's nice. Thank you. Bye. I'm going to do what we're going to do anyway. Right? There's no regulatory oversight at all. And if you look at some of the proposals that went through in recent years, there's been more and more of a trend, sort of in the anti-NIMBY mindset, I think, which is not a very well thought out point of view, to basically make it impossible, not only for the public to object, or even for direct abutters to object, but even the appointed planning board, whose job is supposed to be to plan, or the Board of Zoning Appeals for that matter, to take away their ability to object. That has been the trend. So this may be election day, and people may be getting all worked up about, the possibility of electing a fascist. But, it seems like, if the fascism is perfectly agreeable with our personal goals, then some people locally here can be perfectly okay with it. You know, like gosh forbid that the public can actually raise objections, because don't you know we have a greater goal, because we are the wise ones. I actually think public process is a good thing. And I will defend it in every instance, top to bottom, period, end of story. Anyway, another thing that's happening, I'll just sort of mention it quickly here, is that the Central Square rezoning is still proceeding. Where it will land, I don't know. I'm okay with a fair amount of new height and density in Central Square. But it has been very interesting to hear many of the members of the public come out, including people who are the ones you would think would normally be okay with this, who are saying, we're very concerned about this. We're concerned about the height, and we're concerned, and actually, come to think of it, even the big massive upzoning that's being billed as multifamily zoning proposal. There are a lot of people from the Port neighborhood who are concerned that currently what they like to call naturally occurring affordable housing, basically Mrs. McGillicuddy's triple decker where she doesn't charge excessive rents, that those properties are all going to get bought up by developers and turned into, you know, um, you know, 6 and 7 story, um, much higher rent buildings. And I don't think they're wrong. I mean, I don't like them for the most part, but I don't think they're wrong on this one. Their remedy of just, well, we should only allow 100% affordable housing is stupid, though, because there's no way that that can be supported with a city's tax base. Every affordable housing unit is a net lead weight on the city's tax levy. So anyway, I think that's pretty much it. So good luck getting through election night, and we'll see you soon on Cambridge Inside Out.